Welcome back to the Lydia Magruder channel. I'm continuing my 2023 series on undesigned coincidences. And today what I want to do is I want to talk about an undesigned coincidence in the Gospels and the concept of internal evidence of independence. Please go back over the other videos in this 2023 series thus far if you need some background. And I've been talking in previous videos about non-biblical examples and about the concept of internal versus external independence and internal versus external evidence of independence. Why is it not necessarily a problem if your two sources are not what they call witness separated? You will very often hear skeptics and even some non-skeptics dismissing the evidence of undesigned coincidences by saying, well, they knew one another. They had a chance to talk. The authors had a chance to read the earlier documents. They were not witness separated. And so this undermines any attempt to do undesigned coincidences because, of course, these things weren't undesigned because they were dependent on one another or they were aware of the things that the others had said. So today I'm going to talk about a coincidence concerning the saying, destroy this temple and in 3 days I will raise it, from the Gospel of John and the Gospel of Mark, to show you how this internal evidence of independence works. So I'm going to start first with a passage in Mark, which a lot of critics, a lot of scholars claim is the earliest of the Gospels. But regardless of whether it is the earliest, I'm completely open to the idea that it's the earliest. It certainly was written prior to the Gospel of John. So I'm going to read this. This is from Jesus' trial before the Sanhedrin, when he was going to be condemned for blasphemy and crucified. Notice that this particular set of things doesn't even have anything to do with a miracle. I'm perfectly willing to talk about undesigned coincidences that come from miracle stories. And in fact, I think it's an interesting point that you find them in miracle stories as well as non-miracle stories. But in this case, there shouldn't even be any, sort of cognitive dissonance for a naturalist or for someone who is skeptical of the miraculous, because this is just about things Jesus said or supposedly said, things that witnesses against him said, and it's got nothing to do with any particular miracle. All right, so this is from Mark 14, beginning at verse 57. And some stood up and began to give false testimony against him, saying, we heard him say, I will destroy this temple made with hands, and in 3 days I will build another made without hands. All right. Now, that's a little weird. I want you to think about how we might respond to something like that in the digital age. Just think for a minute. If your favorite political candidate or something were supposedly quoted by witnesses as saying something that sounded bad. Okay, so, threatening to destroy the temple, however you would do it, it's not like they had bombs, but threatening to destroy the temple would not go over well with the Jewish audience. The temple was very precious to them. So this is supposed to be, testimony against Jesus. He said he would destroy the temple. But at the same time, it says that he would raise it again, a temple not made with hands, in 3 days. Now, I think in a digital age, if we heard something like this, we would be inclined to say, I wonder what he really said. I wonder if there's something that he really said that sounded a little bit like that, but that they're getting garbled. And it even says in the next verse that they didn't agree. Their exact testimony did not agree with one another. And that's important in the context of a Jewish trial, because things are supposed to be established by 2 or more witnesses, sort of a multiple attestation legal requirement. But I think what we'd be doing is we'd be Googling, we'd be checking, like, I wonder what he really said. I wonder what the story really is there. Because there are aspects of this that almost have a sound of a garbled thing that the person said that wasn't quite that. So like the specificity of the reference to 3 days, or the claim that he would raise the temple again. I mean, that's not really especially blasphemous if you think about it. I mean, if they're just making up something bad out of whole cloth to accuse him of blasphemy, why make up that part about raising it again in 3 days? So this could make you think that there was something behind it that he had really said, but that they don't quite have right. But if your search were confined to Mark or to Matthew or to Luke, the synoptic gospels as they're called, you would not find any further explanation. They have this record of the witnesses at his Sanhedrin trial saying this about him, but nothing that could have lain behind it. No further explanation, nothing else. For all you could know from reading the synoptics, this might have been made up out of whole cloth. It says it was false, but of course something can be false without being completely invented. And again, we know that from the digital age, right? We can say that's not true. That's not really what he said. But there's something that he really said that wasn't that bad, that was in the vicinity of it, right? So claiming that it's false isn't the same thing necessarily as claiming that it's just like corresponds to nothing whatsoever in reality. But you don't find that explanation of what it could be in the synoptic gospels. Go over to John. Okay, John 2. Now, John has just told a story about Jesus cleansing the temple, turning over tables, chasing people out, and so forth. All right, and it says, the Jews, therefore, answered and said to him, "What sign do you show us, seeing that you do these things?" So this is John 2:18 and following. Jesus answered and said to them, "Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up." Okay, the Jews therefore said, "It took 46 years to build this temple, and will you raise it up in 3 days?" But he was speaking of the temple of his body. Okay, so this is a completely different context. This is a story about Jesus cleansing the temple in John. Now, my first point about internal evidence of independence is that it's just a famous alleged contradiction between John and the synoptics that John tells of Jesus cleansing the temple right at the beginning of his ministry, sets it there very firmly, and the synoptics tell of Jesus cleansing the temple, in Passion Week at the end of his ministry. And not just skeptics, but some Christian scholars, biblical scholars, very commonly will say, he couldn't have done it twice. Now, I have an entire video series on this. I'm not going to go into it now. I think he did do it twice. So John moved it, etc. Because if you insist that there was only one, then this is a contradiction. One of them taking place about 3 years before the other. And it's in that context that we find the background of the comment at Jesus' trial reported in the synoptics. So it's in the context of a passage that's taken to be in contradiction to the synoptics, and that at a minimum doesn't have any parallel in the synoptics at that time in Jesus' ministry. Because they come to him and they're like, who do you think you are, that you're throwing people out of the temple? You're making this disturbance, what credential do you have of your right to cause this kind of disturbance? And then Jesus says this cryptic thing, destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up. It's in that context. John does not record the aspect of the trial where they say we heard him say he would destroy the temple and raise it up in 3 days, a temple not made with hands. Okay, so John records a saying of Jesus that explains the witness testimony in Mark. And Mark records the witness testimony that is explained by the saying in John. But neither one of them records the other half, the other part. Moreover, it occurs in a passage in John that's taken to be a contradiction. And that, certainly John doesn't, bother to explain. He doesn't say, oh, by the way, he also cleansed the temple later or anything like that. He just records this temple cleansing earlier. Now, yes, John may have had access to Mark. He may have heard it read in the churches. They read the house churches, the gatherings of the Christians. They read the Gospels aloud. They may have read Mark. John probably knew John Mark. He may have even known him. He for sure knew Peter, who was considered to be Mark's prime witness for what Mark tells about. So that the authors of John and Mark are not witness separated by any means. Okay, and I would never claim that they were. But there's this internal evidence of independence, that each of them only has one half of this. Now, and that it occurs in the temple cleansing narrative in John. Now, imagine that someone were to try to say that John invented this saying, John being the later gospel, okay, because he was aware of Mark, and that he said, oh, there's that weird thing in the trial in Mark about destroy this temple. I'll, make Jesus say something that sounds kind of like that, but I'll put it in a completely different context to explain that, because that'll be this cool kind of little Easter egg for people who know Mark. That is excessively subtle. It just doesn't look like that at all. And this is something that skeptics just don't get. They do not have a consistent portrayal of these authors. On the one hand, they will portray them as having blunders, egregious contradictions with one another, changing facts from one another, not taking any trouble to try to agree with one another. But then on the other hand, when you have something like this, where you've got this great little puzzle fit between the saying in John and the witness testimony in Mark, suddenly they're all full of these hyper subtle connection theories, where the later author is deliberately trying to fit his gospel with the earlier gospel, but is doing it in this subtle way that might easily be overlooked just because I guess he thinks it's cool or something, and somebody might notice it. You have to get a sense of common sense, which is what we try to do on this channel, to recognize how that's not a psychologically consistent portrait of the author. If John is that concerned to harmonize his gospel with Mark, to fit his gospel with Mark, then why is he narrating an earlier temple cleansing, giving no explanation of why his is earlier or whether there were two or what's going on? And there, of course, are many other places where skeptics and critical biblical scholars will claim that Mark and John contradict one another. I'm not even going to try to give you a list right now. There's a bunch of them. Okay? Those are also evidence of independence. Those are evidence against the idea that John is basing his gospel on Mark and attempting to make it fit together in these cool ways with Mark. So even if he's not independent in the sense of being witness separated, he appears to be narrating independently. That is, narrating stuff without trying to make it fit with Mark. But in that case, this puzzle-like fit is evidence of truth. That Jesus really made this comment. And then there was about 3 years for it to get, garbled in people's memory. And it comes out at his trial. We heard him say he would destroy the temple made with hands and in 3 days raise up a temple not made with hands. That kind of thing happens in human life all the time. It's something, and sometimes in a lot less time than 3 years, that something just gets kind of garbled up as it gets told and retold. And that statement by the witnesses looks like exactly that type of version of this saying of Jesus in John in a completely different context. So this is what I mean by internal evidence of independence. Each side has only one part of it. It occurs, in this case, even in a passage in John that's supposed to contradict Mark. There are multiple other places where John is supposedly contradicting Mark. And so it looks like these two are not coming together because of the knowledge that the alleged witnesses had of each other's statements. Even though they're not witness separated, that doesn't seem to be why John is saying what he's saying when he records this statement made by Jesus. So I hope that shows how this concept of internal evidence of independence applies to undesigned coincidences in the Gospels, just as it applies to apparent undesigned coincidences outside the Gospels. Undesigned, meaning they're not trying to fit it together. Coincidence, in this case, meaning coincidence coming together. They coincide, but not because someone was trying to make them coincide. Okay, now those of you who are already familiar with the argument, that may all be review for you. But I'm doing this new series this year because I really want people for whom the argument is new or who've been thrown by this claim that, these undesigned coincidence apologists, they're just doing some weird Christian apologist thing and they don't understand that the gospel authors were all dependent on one another anyway. Checkmate, apologists, or as they now say, checkmate, Mick-apologists, because there's this dependence, so that's the end of the argument. It's way stronger than that. We have responses to that based upon internal evidence of independence in access to the facts. Okay, I haven't decided what I'm going to do next time. I'm hoping to continue this series on methodology and undesigned coincidence. But right now, your guess is almost as good as mine as to where I'm going to go next in that series. So come back next time to see where I go, to the Lydia Magruder channel, where we're making common sense rigorous.